The red-hot iron left a perfect mark on bare skin. A circle burned deep, stamped with the initials of an owner, placed carefully on the left thigh where no tunic could ever hide it. The girl did not scream. She had no tears left. At her feet, the marble floor of the Athenian agora darkened with fresh blood. Just a few steps away, free citizens celebrated the triumphs of democracy. It was the year 430 BCE, the golden age of Athens. That mark was not the punishment of a criminal. It was a brand of ownership. She was 12 years old, bought for less money than the price of a loaf of barley bread. They say the body does not lie. And in classical Athens, the bodies of thousands of women told a story philosophers chose not to write. A story of a system that turned human flesh into property, sexual violence into law, and suffering into public revenue. A system so disturbing that Athens buried it in silence, written into law, taxed by the state, and avoided by the men who spoke endlessly about virtue. While Socrates spoke of virtue in shaded gardens, while Pericles praised equality before the law, while playwrights wrote tragedies about honor and human dignity. A few streets away, the most organized and legally protected trade in female bodies in the ancient world operated in full daylight. And the most disturbing part wasn't that it existed. It was that no one questioned it. This is not the story of a queen or a fallen princess. It is the story of thousands of nameless women whose broken bodies financed the glory of Athens, whose pain paid for its temples, its theaters, and its democracy. To understand how the cradle of freedom became a hell for half its population, we have to descend into the parts of history philosophy books never wanted you to see. If hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe to Grim History, hit the like button, and once you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. To understand how sexual slavery became normal in Athens, we have to move backward in time to the 6th century BCE, when the reforms of Solon laid the foundations of what would later be celebrated as democracy. These reforms are remembered as acts of liberation. Debt slavery among citizens was abolished, political participation was widened, law replaced blood feuds. For free Athenian men, Solon's reforms represented justice, balance, and order. But hidden inside those reforms was a fatal contradiction. The freedom of some citizens was built directly on the total enslavement of others. Solon's laws carefully defined who counted as a person under the law and who did not. Rights were expanded, but only inward. Outside that boundary, absolute ownership remained untouched. And among all enslaved people, none were more exposed, more disposable than the women forced into the sexual trade. The system itself was brutally simple because it was meant to be efficient. Girls entered Athens through 3 main paths. Some were born enslaved, the daughters of women already prostituted, inheriting bondage before they could speak. Others were taken during the city's constant wars of expansion, absorbed as war spoils. But most commonly, they were sold by their own families when hunger, debt, and despair erased any remaining choice. Poverty did not excuse the sale, it justified it. There was no minimum age. Surviving documents mention girls as young as 7 being prepared for use, trained before their bodies had even matured. Other records show higher prices paid for those who had not yet begun menstruation, treated as rarer, more valuable commodities precisely because of their youth. Once purchased, they were taken to the ergasteria, specialized workshops where human beings were sorted like livestock. Bodies were examined. Teeth, skin, posture, and obedience were assessed. The most beautiful were assigned to elite symposia, where conversation and performance mattered as much as sex. Those considered average were sent to brothels near the port, and those judged ugly, weak, or sick were pushed into the most degraded districts of the Ceramicus, where any man could use them for the price of a loaf of bread. But every one of them, without exception, was branded with hot iron. The pain was intentional. The scar was permanent. It carried a single message: this body does not belong to you. It never has. It never will. Their owners did not call them women. They called them andropoda, men's feet, a term that reduced human beings to walking tools. Under Solon's law, killing a sexual slave carried the same penalty as destroying a plough, a fine paid to the owner for damaged property. There was no legal concept of rape against them, because in the eyes of the law, they lacked the capacity to consent or to refuse. Their only function was to receive. Their only identity was availability. The Athenian state did not merely tolerate this trade, It organized it. Brothels required licenses. Every sexual transaction was taxed. Officials known as astynomoi were appointed to inspect enslaved women regularly, ensuring they remained fit for use. These inspections were not moral judgments, they were quality control. If a woman became ill, she was removed until she recovered or died. If she became pregnant, the fetus was aborted using methods that frequently killed her as well. If she aged or lost her appeal, she was sold downward through lower establishments until she ended on the streets, begging, gambling, and prostituting herself for scraps of food. Tax records reveal the scale of this system. Between 15 and 20% of the Athenian state's revenue came from the sexual trade. That money funded public buildings, religious festivals, theatrical performances, and even the schools where philosophers lectured about virtue and human dignity. The same democracy that praised equality depended financially on systematic exploitation. The paradox was complete. Wisdom was paid for with blood. Beauty was built on pain. Freedom rested on invisible chains. And as if economic exploitation were not enough, Athens went further. It found a way to transform sexual violence itself into sacred ritual during the Great Dionysia, the festivals honoring Dionysus, god of wine and fertility. Enslaved women were not merely used during these celebrations. They were offered as living sacrifices in ceremonies that lasted entire days and turned collective violation into divine worship. March 425 BCE. Athens glowed with torchlight, masks, and wine. The Great Dionysia had begun, the city's most important festival. Fertility, theatre, and renewal were celebrated openly. Citizens crowded into performances by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, watching tragedies that explored justice, fate, and the dignity of the human soul. Yet behind this cultural brilliance, darker rituals unfolded. Ancient sources describe Dionysian ceremonies, blending ecstatic worship, performance, and symbolic fertility rites. Enslaved women, and those bound to temples, participated under rigid structures that erased all personal will. For 5 days, Athens lived a disturbing double life. Art reached its highest expression, while religion justified hierarchy, domination, and symbolic human sacrifice. What citizens experienced as divine communion, the victims endured as silence. And so, while tragedies about compassion and justice played on stage, customs that denied those very ideals were carried out just beyond the theatre walls. The Athenian contradiction stood exposed. The city of reason and art sustained itself through practices that turned faith into an instrument of control. Yet even this ritualized brutality was not the most terrifying feature of the system. The true horror lay elsewhere, because sexual slavery was not a side effect of Athenian democracy. It was its quiet economic engine. Every vote cast in the assembly, every speech delivered in the agora, every sculpture and temple adorning the Acropolis. All of it was paid for, in part, by the systematic suffering of women reduced to commodities. Fragments of tax records preserved on papyrus and ostraca reveal the scale. In the port of Piraeus alone, more than 200 officially registered brothels operated, employing nearly 8,000 enslaved women. Each establishment paid an annual license equal to 6 months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Every sexual act was taxed at 10%, collected directly from clients through tokens sold by state officials. But money was only the beginning. Because this system did not operate in isolation, it pulled the entire city into its orbit. And that is where the story becomes even darker. The system did not operate alone. It pulled nearly every layer of Athenian society into its machinery. Not as passive observers, but as active participants. Slaves built and repaired the brothels, cleaning blood from stone floors before dawn. Artisans forged locks, shackles, and restraint devices designed for repeated use. Physicians performed abortions and treated venereal diseases, not to heal, but to return bodies to circulation. Priests blessed rituals that turned exploitation into duty. Officials supervised inspections with ledgers in hand. Citizens worked openly as pimps. Even free Athenian women sometimes served as overseers, enforcing discipline on younger enslaved girls they did not consider their equals. No part of the city stood outside the system. Everyone knew where the money came from. The placement of the brothels was deliberate. The largest and most expensive establishments clustered around the agora so citizens could visit them after voting, debating, or delivering speeches. Politics ended. Consumption began. Mid-priced brothels surrounded the harbour, where foreign merchants spent money that never circulated back home. The cheapest operated in artisan districts, where labourers and urban slaves paid meagre sums for access to women already broken by exhaustion, illness, and fear. Each tier followed a pricing system carefully regulated by the state, not negotiated, not improvised, but enforced. A night with the first category slave, young, attractive, trained in music and conversation, cost the equivalent of 3 days' wages for a hoplite soldier. Second category, women were priced like a full meal at a respectable tavern. Third category, women were rented for the cost of a cup of watered-down wine. Those who were sick, elderly, or pregnant were offered free of charge to anyone willing to use them, framed as a public service subsidized by the state, a final extraction from bodies no longer profitable. The law protected this system with precision. Owners and clients were insulated from consequence, while any attempt at resistance was criminalized. A woman who refused a client could be publicly whipped to discourage imitation. One who attempted escape was branded on the face, a permanent warning, and sold to gladiators, where public violation became part of the spectacle. A woman who struck a client, even in self-defense, could be executed immediately, without testimony, without trial, without record. Yet the law also imposed disturbing protections for the enslaved themselves, exposing the system's true logic. It was forbidden to permanently injure them without the owner's consent. It was forbidden to kill them without compensation. It was forbidden to steal them or use them without paying the required fees. In other words, Athenian law protected sexual slaves exactly as it protected any other form of private property, not because they were human, but because they had market value. All of this unfolded while the greatest philosophers in human history debated justice, virtue, and the good life just meters away from markets selling human bodies. Socrates taught that wisdom began with acknowledging ignorance, yet never publicly challenged a system that reduced half the population to instruments of use. Plato imagined a republic ruled by philosopher kings, while accepting slavery as necessary to free citizens from labor. Aristotle defined humans as political animals and argued that some people, especially women and foreigners, were slaves by nature, and that using them sexually was as natural as using tools to build. The contradiction was not accidental, it was structural. Athenian democracy, built on the ideal of equal participation among free citizens, functioned only because the majority of labor, physical, emotional, and sexual, was delegated to people without rights, voice, or legal existence. The freedom of some rested entirely on the absolute unfreedom of others. And among all the enslaved, women forced into the sexual trade were the most exposed, the least protected, and the easiest to erase. Most did not live beyond 25. Their bodies, destroyed by years of repeated violence, untreated disease, forced abortions with crude instruments, and the psychological damage of an existence reduced to function, simply stopped resisting. When that happened, the system had already prepared for their disappearance. There were no cemeteries for sex slaves, no funeral rites, no mourning families, no names carved in stone. Disposal was the owner's responsibility, handled as cheaply as possible. Most bodies were dumped into the Barathron, a deep pit outside Athens where executed criminals, dead slaves, and animal remains were thrown. There, mixed with refuse and carrion, thousands of women dissolved into anonymous soil. Others were sold even after death to medical schools, where students practiced dissections. Greek physicians believed the bodies of heavily used women offered better anatomical insight than those of virgins or respectable matrons. Even in death, their bodies continued to serve the intellectual progress of the civilization that had destroyed them. But the most chilling fate awaited those who survived past usefulness. As age erased their value, they were pushed into the lowest tier of the system, illegal brothels hidden in cellar basements where men paid with coins or scraps of food. Conditions there were so brutal that death was often a release. Later, Christian moralists, writing centuries afterward, preserved fragments of what happened in these places. Women in their 40s, toothless and diseased, were raped by groups of adolescents as part of initiation rituals. Others, blind, deaf, or mutilated, were rented at reduced prices as defective merchandise. And even this was not the end of the system's cruelty, because what happened to the children born inside it was worse still. Pregnant women, carrying children conceived by unknown clients, gave birth in the same rooms where they worked, on the same floors, under the same roofs, sometimes between clients, so their daughters could be absorbed into the system immediately, without ever experiencing a free childhood. There was no separation between birth and bondage. Life began already assigned a price, and throughout this entire process, Athenian society maintained a level of hypocrisy that reveals the depth of its moral collapse. The same laws that fiercely protected the sexual virtue of citizen women, daughters, wives, and mothers of citizens, imposing death penalties on anyone who dishonored them, simultaneously legitimized the sexual enslavement of everyone else. An Athenian citizen who raped the wife of another citizen could be executed on the spot by the offended husband. That very same man could violate 100 enslaved women in a single night and remain a respected, ordinary participant in civic life. The division was not merely legal, it was moral, and it was religious. Citizen women were considered sacred because their sexual purity guaranteed the legitimacy of citizen bloodlines. Sexual slaves were considered necessary because their availability protected that purity, redirecting male desire toward bodies that could not contaminate the lineage of Athens. Desire itself was not condemned, it was redirected downward. In other words, the virtue of some was sustained entirely through the absolute degradation of others. This logic reached its most refined expression in the philosophy of the age. Aristotle argued that the difference between a wife and a sexual slave was the same as the difference between a musical instrument and a work tool. Both were useful, but for entirely different purposes. A wife, he claimed, was like a lyre, designed to produce harmony within the household and beauty in offspring. A sexual slave was like a hammer, meant to satisfy basic needs without affecting the quality of the primary work. Pleasure without consequence, use without responsibility. And while philosophers refined these distinctions, while politicians debated justice and virtue in the assembly, while playwrights composed tragedies about fate, honor, and human dignity, every day, in every brothel across Athens, nameless women deteriorated, their bodies breaking first, their minds following, until physical death finally released them from an existence that had never truly been life, only function. Centuries later, when Christian emperors closed the last brothels, when the final sexual slaves died in obscurity, when the system that had consumed them collapsed into dust, the monuments built with their suffering still remained. The Parthenon, eternal symbol of Greek beauty and wisdom, had been financed in part through taxes levied on their pain. The theatre of Dionysus, where the most sublime tragedies of world literature were performed, had also been the setting for some of the most systematic, ritualized sexual violence in history. Even today, 25 centuries later, millions of people walk among these ruins without knowing what paid for them. They admire the perfection of white marble without asking how much blood purchased it. They celebrate Greek philosophy without questioning how theories of human dignity were developed alongside the routine dehumanization of half the population, because this is the truth history books prefer not to confront. There is no innocent beauty when it is built on suffering. There is no pure wisdom when it coexists with brutality. There is no civilization worthy of admiration when it reserves humanity for only some. Classical Athens gave us democracy, philosophy, theatre, and architecture that define Western culture. But it also gave us the clearest demonstration that humanity's greatest achievements can coexist with its most extreme crimes, and that the capacity for beauty is inseparable from the capacity for cruelty. This is not the story of a fallen princess or a queen undone by passion. It is the story of thousands of women who lost their humanity so that a civilization could preserve its glory. It is the story of bodies burned with iron so other bodies could be immortalized in marble. It is the story of voices erased forever so other voices could echo through history. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it is written by the executioners. For more than 2,000 years, the story of Athens has been told by those who praised its greatness while ignoring its brutality, who admired its wisdom while forgetting